Welcome to our third interview as part of this Creative Arts in FE project. I'm Eddie Playfair, and I'm a Senior Policy Manager at the Association of Colleges, AOC. Following the success of the Creative Writing in FE project 2023, we're now launching a new version which opens up the brief to include creative writing, photography, visual arts, and spoken word. Um, celebrating creative writing is still at the core of this opportunity. The Creative Arts in FE project is sponsored by the Copyright Licensing Agency and the UAL awarding body. We're very proud to be delivering this project, and it's being managed by my brilliant colleague, Emma Cracknell. So today I'm really excited to be joined by the third of our interviewees, who is Okechukwu Nzelu. Okechukwu, I'm really looking forward to learning about your journey as a writer and how you work, and maybe a bit of advice you might have for any young creatives who are watching this interview. Um, Dr. Okechukwu Nzelu is a Manchester-based writer. In 2015, he received a Northern Writers Award from New Writing North. His debut novel, The Private Joys of Nena Maloney, won a Betty Trask Award and was shortlisted for the Desmond Elliott Prize and the Polari First Book Prize, and longlisted for the Portico Prize. In 2021, it was selected for the Kingston University Big Read. His second novel, Here Again Now, published in 2022, was shortlisted for the Royal Society of Literature Encore Award, the Polari Prize, the Jalak Prize, and the Diverse Book Awards. He's been on national radio, he's a regular contributor to Kinfolk magazine, and he's a lecturer in creative writing at Lancaster University. And he's also a non-executive director of the Copyright Licensing Agency. And Okechukwu is currently working on his third novel. So, Okechukwu, you're clearly, after from that list of awards and prizes, you're clearly an established writer now, and you've achieved a lot of success. But can I take you back to start us off to your childhood, really, and your earliest memories of writing? Was the 16-year-old Okechukwu already a writer, a storyteller? How did you get started?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for letting me be involved in this really fantastic project. And yeah, I think I was always very interested in writing and reading. For me, as I think for a lot of people who like writing, reading was a kind of a safe space. So I loved being able to go to the library and just the fact that you could take out as many books as you could possibly get through in a week or two was just fantastic. It felt like freedom. I grew up in a very strict, conservative Nigerian family, and so reading was the one sort of thing that wasn't really that closely monitored. It was just, I think, like a lot of parents, my parents were just happy that we were reading at all. So for me to be able to decide what I wanted to read and pick the stories that were most interesting to me was just really freeing. And I think I moved from there to the idea that that was something that I could then do for other people. I think writing is one of those things that you can learn how to do it as you go along, and you also sort of learn how the professional side of it works as you get older. You know what it means to have an agent, what it means to have a publisher, all these sort of processes and things that are involved in the business of being a writer. So I learned a lot about that as I grew older. But I think for me as a 16-year-old, it was just about enjoying writing stories. English was always my favorite subject. I loved like reading plays and poems and novels and short stories. And it just felt natural to me, I guess, that I should have a go at doing it myself. It's definitely been there's been a lot of trial and error. There's been a lot of trial and error, and I've made just as many mistakes as the next person, and still am. As you say, I'm working on my third novel, so I'm right in the trenches now. But yeah, it's been a long-term passion for sure.
And you grew up in Manchester, didn't you? And what a lot of young writers ask is, where do you get your ideas from? And the answer often comes back, well, write what you know, write what you experience. Um, was that what you did? Because you also talked about your Nigerian background, your Igbo background. Is Was that important as well?
Yeah, I think maybe more important than I realized even at the time. What I was writing in my first novel, The Private Joys of Nana Maloney, was definitely about Manchester and the world that I grew up in. And just realizing how important it was that I'd grown up in this very multicultural world. I remember reading a book called White Teeth by Zadie Smith when I was about 21, and realizing that this book, which I think was published in the early 2000s, about 20 years ago now, was the first book that I had read at the time that reflected multicultural Britain in the way that I had experienced it growing up. You know, kids from lots of different religions and different backgrounds and ethnicities. Um, and I loved that. I didn't realize before that it was possible. So that made me realize that that was something that was really important to me. And I think the point you raise about writing what you know is a really interesting one. I teach creative writing now, as you said earlier, and when I'm talking to my students, I think this is a really interesting question to debate. Should you just write what you know? I think on the one hand, writing what you know is often great because it means it's what you're passionate about, and it's what you feel most confident about. And if you feel confident and passionate about something, you're much more likely to make your readers feel passionate and interested in what you're writing about. But also, I think there's something to be said for learning about the world and trying to push yourself outside of your comfort zone. So, you know, my first novel was written from the point of view of two female characters and one male character. So I had to think about, you know, how somebody might experience the world differently from me if they were female. My main character, Nena, she grew up in a family where she didn't have Igbo heritage in the house. Her mum was white, her dad wasn't around. And she had to sort of go on that journey of learning about what it means to be Igbo and learning about the language that for me, I didn't have to go on that same journey in quite the same way. So I was using, I guess, some of my own experience. And I think that's what made it fun, that I was also I was learning, I was imagining, empathizing. And I think that's probably a big part of what writers go into the sort of job for. So I think I'd say, you know, to anybody starting out with writing, yeah, absolutely write what you know, but try to have fun with using your imagination, with learning and imagining the lives of people who are maybe a bit different from you as well.
That's brilliant. Thank you. And you talked a little bit about identity, and sometimes when you look at the blurb on the back of a book, you know, you'll see this is about identity, or this is about these big themes like love and, you know, identity, relationships. Um, do you set out to write a book um, about something, or do you let the narrative, do you let the story sort of carry you?
That's a really good question. I think I tend to start with a relationship, a dynamic. So in my first book, I knew I wanted to write about a single mother and her daughter. That really interested me because, well, partly because I'd grown up with a single mum myself, so that was a situation that I knew from my own experience. And I was also again kind of interested in looking at how it might have been different if the circumstances had been slightly different. So I think for me, I start with the relationship and then I move outwards from there. I sort of thought, okay, a mother and daughter, but what kind of mother? What are her experiences? What's her background? What's her past? What does she want from life, and what does she not have that she wishes she had? And the same with the daughter. And I guess from there, I then sort of fill in the blanks about what their identities might be. And for me, when I'm writing, there's a huge amount of chopping and changing in the early stages. I might write a very early draft that will look completely different from the later ones in terms of who the characters are, what their character arcs are, what they're looking for, what motivates them. All those things can really change a lot very early on because it's part of this huge process of trying to just figure out what fits. And I think as a writer, you kind of develop a sense of what works for you, the kind of stories that you feel that you can tell, the kind of stories that you feel work and are believable and convincing. So for me, as I wouldn't say that necessarily identity is a central part of the early idea, but it can certainly play a really important role once everything has sort of solidified itself.
That's great. And the other thing that struck me is that you write humorously very well. I mean, there's some very, very funny passages, and finding that humor in the everyday is pretty special, I think. In and sometimes it's very easy to get it wrong, isn't it? Is it as easy as it looks? I mean, how do you go about writing something? Do you set out to say, I'm going to make this funny? You know,
That's a really good question. I don't know how easy it looks. If it looks easy, I've probably done my job well, but it certainly isn't easy. I wrote several drafts of my first novel before my agent or publisher even saw it. I redrafted, I think, something like 7 or 8 times because I was just figuring things out by myself, and I hadn't studied creative writing formally at that time. So there were many, many drafts, and each time I did a draft, I changed something. Maybe I'd change the setting and figure it out from there, or I'd change, I'd add a character or get rid of a character. And one of the drafts that I did was about trying to make the novel funny because I realized actually I've got a lot of heavy subject matter here. There's some dark subject matter in this novel, which is great, which is fine, which I'm comfortable with. But I felt that the novel would work better if I were trying to infuse a bit of that with some humor and sort of balance it a bit and give the reader a bit of a chance to breathe. And that was sort of how I made that decision. So I really did very consciously set out and think, I want this to be funny, which is not an easy thing to do. There's a lot of thinking about, oh, does this really work? And, would somebody else find this funny? What kind of humor is this? Does it feel jarring, or does it feel different from the kind of humor that I'm maybe using in a different part of the novel? It took me a long time to kind of figure out what my sort of rhythm was. And I think that's probably true of most parts of writing. So I would say that writing comedy, writing humor, it's difficult, but it also encapsulates a lot of the stuff that is true of any part of your writing. It doesn't happen overnight. It doesn't happen immediately. It takes work. It takes trial and error. It takes multiple drafts, and I think that that's fine. Certainly for me, a big part of learning to write has been being comfortable with just how long it can take, and that you do make mistakes, and that you need to improve every time you do something, and you try different things, and giving yourself that freedom to write something that's not perfect the first time around is really, really important. But one of the things I like about writing comedy, which I'm doing again now, is that it is a really great barometer for how well something's working. It's quite difficult to write a funny novel that is bad in other ways because comedy depends on so many different things. If you're reading something and there are jokes in there, but it seems cruel, or you don't know enough about the character for the joke to work, these kind of things that make comedy work are just really important for writing generally. So I really like writing comedy, as hard as it is, because it's a good way of letting yourself, of kind of testing whether the book is working as a whole. As difficult as that can be, it's kind of handy in a way.
Yes, and if it's contextual and it flows from the context, it feels much more real. And as you say, if the reader's going to feel that it's punching down or being cruel, then that's clearly not going to work. Yeah. And you talked about publishers and agents and people. Who else do you show your work to others much? Do you value feedback from others much? Because we've, in previous interviews with other writers, people have talked about the value of affirmation and praise, but also the value of really constructive criticism from people you trust. Is that part of your process as well?
Yeah, definitely. Writing is such a solitary thing. You're sitting in a room by yourself most of the time, just writing away, and it can be easy to lose sense of where you stand and how good you feel that your writing is, and especially if you've been working on a long project like a novel for a while, it can be hard to kind of to see it accurately because you're so used to kind of digging into the detail on the sentence level. So I really value that. I have a few friends who I will trust to read my work and give me some honest feedback. And that is really valuable because it takes time. And so if somebody takes the time out of their day to let you know what they think is or isn't working, that's incredibly valuable. And it's, yeah, what you said about affirmation and this sort of honest feedback, I think is really important. I think for a lot of the time when you're just starting out, especially if you're very young, maybe the thing you need the most is encouragement. That was certainly true for me, because it's so easy to feel as though you're not good enough, or you don't, you're never going to measure up to the writers that you admire, and to just stop writing because you feel like maybe you don't deserve to, and that would be a real shame. I think that happens quite a lot. So it is important, I think, to get encouragement and affirmation. But I also think one of the things about writing, as you say, is learning to handle feedback that isn't necessarily what you wanted to hear, and that's partly just a sense of, partly just a case of, you know, having quite thick skin. But I think it's about learning that you are not your work. It's really important to make that distinction between you as a person and the work that you have created. Um, you as a person need encouragement and a gentle approach, and um, sensitivity. But the work is not a person, and it needs to be kind of sometimes torn apart and cut up and chopped and changed. And I think once you develop that, which is definitely a process and something that um, is never, for me, easy to start with. It's always something I have to ease myself into. But once you develop that, it becomes quite liberating, and to realize that, how good your work is doesn't really say anything about you as a person or your worth or your value. It's just a case of something needing to improve or change or try something different, and that can make it a lot easier to get that feedback, which I really value. I remember when I first met my agent, the person who's now my agent, and one of the first questions she asked me was, "Are you comfortable with editorial feedback?" Because obviously, if you are working with an editor, they're going to be sort of telling you things about your book, some of which will be positive, some of which are less so, and you need to be able to take that on. And I was desperate for it because I've been working on this book for such a long time. Yeah, as I say, I wrote something like 7 or 8 drafts. Um, and finally, to have somebody professional who's experienced and engaged as well in your work, that was hugely valuable for me. I think it's true that I went to a talk once by Zadie Smith. I really love that writer, who sort of said that the thing about writing is it's one of the very few spaces where, after you leave school, people will read your work just because you've written it, and that, I think, is really true. And to have people, an editor and an agent who knows your work really carefully and who really believes in you, reading your work and giving you feedback is immensely valuable.
That's brilliant. Very very good advice. And I think you mentioned Zadie Smith quite a few times. Can you say anything else about reading and to what extent your reading has influenced your writing? Because I think a lot of young people find themselves sometimes in a bit of a rut in a genre that they love, and they're
Mm.
reading, a lot of stuff in that same genre, and they often turn to teachers to advise them about what should I read, where do I go to kind of broaden my reading. I mean, obviously, reading has been important to you. Can you say a bit about what you enjoy reading and to what extent your reading has influenced your writing?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point you make about how easy it is to get stuck in a rut as a young person. Learning your way around a library or a bookshop is a lifelong project, I think. As you say, it's quite easy to get stuck in your comfort zone. I think most people are creatures of habit, whether that's about reading or food that they like or where they like to go on holiday or anything else. So it is quite easy to just kind of get stuck in that rut. But I think writing requires you to challenge yourself every now and again and to introduce yourself to different things. So I think I would absolutely encourage anybody who is starting to write or thinking about writing to draw on those resources like a teacher or a librarian, who can sort of help you find something that might be a bit outside of your comfort zone or something new. Because in order for you to write well, I think you have to be in conversation with the world and through reading. There is a writer who I really admire, who I work with at Lancaster actually, called Jen Ashworth, who talks about it as a kind of breathing in and breathing out. So you're breathing in the reading that you're doing and the culture, and that maybe you go to an art gallery or see a film, and your work, your writing is a kind of a response to that. You're breathing it out, you've processed it, you're making something different and chopping and changing it, and making it your own and making something new. And I think that is really important. So for me, being able to read as much as possible is really important. It reminds me why I write, and I write because I love to read, and I want to be able to give the joy of a good book to other people and to be part of what's going on in that sense. So yeah, and I've been really enjoying reading around some really interesting Black British literature at the moment. I was just interviewing George the Poet. You might know from his podcast on BBC Sounds. He has written a book called Track Record, which has just come out, and it's really, really interesting. He talks about his own experiences of growing up in Britain, in London, his education, and he talks very, very honestly and humbly about the things that he actually didn't know, which I think is really brave of him and generous. I've just been reading a book called Unearthed by Claire Ratinon, which is fantastic. It's about a woman who moves from London to the countryside, and she's a Black woman, she's a woman of colour, and she writes about her experiences as a minority in that environment. She covers, what it was like being there during the COVID pandemic. She talks about the way that she's learned to change her relationship with food, with the growing of food, with the growing of plants, and with nature, and the joy that it brings her, and also the difficulties of it as well. It was a really, really fantastic read, and not the kind of thing that I write. I don't write memoir and nonfiction, but and I don't write about my own life in that way. But I loved reading it, and I think there's something refreshing about reading outside of your comfort zone or outside of what you like to write, because it also reminds you that you're not competing with everybody. You're existing and coexisting. You're sharing a space, maybe even a library bookshelf or something like that. But you're not trying to compete with people. You're just kind of sharing ideas and trading ideas and being inspired and encouraged. And that is what I love about the reading that I've been doing.
Brilliant, thank you. So moving back to writing for a moment, are you allowed to tell us about your current project, about what you're working on now, or is it top secret?
It's very early days, and it's top secret, not because I'm trying to be difficult, so I apologize for that, but just because it's such early days, things change a lot. So if I told you what it's about now, in a year's time, or by the time it comes out, and whenever it does come out, it might be about a completely different thing, and you might feel I've sort of led you down the garden path. But what I can say is it's about a Black British family living in England, and figuring each other out and making mistakes. I am just really interested in family. I'm interested in the support of it and the challenges of it and the tensions of it. I think there's a lot of really interesting things that make up a story that happen within families. So maybe that's why I keep coming back to it. But I'm excited, and I'm enjoying writing it, and to be writing something which, again, like I'm trying to, work with humor. My second book that came out a couple of years ago was much darker and sadder, and I wrote it that way deliberately because I felt that that was what it needed. But it feels really nice to be trying to like work on jokes again, and to be sort of returning to that. So yeah, watch this space.
Brilliant, thank you. Well, we look forward to your next novel. Is there anything else you'd like to say, kind of words of advice for young writers? I mean, you've talked about living as well as writing, and reading, but also stretching your kind of comfort, moving out of your comfort zone. Is there anything else? Is there any other advice you'd have for young writers at the
Yeah,
beginning of their journey?
yeah, I would say if you can, try and go to see a writer talk about their work, maybe at a literature festival or a reading that might be taking place near you. Often they have free and discounted tickets. Um, it's really worth doing. I always find I get a lot of my best ideas from those kinds of things, because hearing somebody talk about something that they're passionate about is inspiring, just the fact of it and being in their presence. And often that's your opportunity to ask them your own questions. I find that if you are maybe growing up outside of the world of writing like I did. I didn't have, my parents weren't writers. It wasn't something that was like a family business. We didn't have like writers going in and out of the house or anything like that. So um, I learned a lot of it just by listening to writers talk and reading their words. And I think that can be a really great way to kind of make the publishing industry seem a little bit less opaque, and kind of find your way into it and remind you that these are human beings who are doing a job like anybody else. So I definitely recommend that. I've learned a lot and had a lot of wonderful experiences by going to literature festivals and hearing writers read.
Well, that's good advice. And I mean, going back to the challenges of getting started, one of our authors that one of our previous authors that we interviewed talked about self-publishing as a way of getting started. Simply just she just wanted to get out there and be in print, and actually her success was built on that. And she's now being picked up by sort of mainstream publishers. Is that something you've tried, or that you have that you know that you have any experience of?
So I'm not very familiar with the world of self-publishing. I know a couple of people who've had great experiences with it. My understanding is that one bit of good advice is to try and surround yourself with as much expertise as you can. Traditional publishing, one of the advantages of traditional publishing is that you have a team of people who are working with you. So you have an editor, a marketing person, sales. You'll have somebody to talk about publicity. You'll have somebody to work on the book cover and so on. As much as you can, if you can replicate that in as a self-published author, that will make life a lot easier for you. Is what I've understood from people who've done it. So maybe you have the resources and the money to pay people to do those jobs, but even if you don't, it's well worth trying to seek out that advice either online or perhaps through networks or through organizations that you might work with, like New Writing North or New Writing South, who do fantastic work with young people. Try and make sure that you um, replicate as much of that expertise as you can. Talk to people who know about covers or look up online what expertise you can find. The Writers and Artists Yearbook is a really fantastic resource that you'll find in pretty much any local library. It gets updated every year with loads of really helpful information on things like listings of publishers and agents, but they also include some really helpful articles about things like self-publishing, about editing, the first draft. All these things are really, really helpful bits of advice. I definitely recommend that book as well.
Okay. Well, Okechukwu, thank you so much for spending time with us and sharing a bit about your journey and your work. Would strongly recommend anyone listening to read your two novels, and we're really looking forward to the third one. Um, Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.